Julian Vance believed the world was a simple machine. You fed it ambition and ruthlessness, and it spat out success. He believed in the clear, bright lines of power. Who had it, who didn't, and how to position oneself closest to the source. His wife, Ilara, fell squarely into the didn't have it category. She was a soft, unassuming woman, a gentle watercolor in his world of sharp, aggressive oils. He had married her 5 years ago, seeing in her a quiet domesticity that would serve as a comfortable, non-threatening backdrop to his ascending life. She was pretty in a faded way, managed the house with quiet efficiency, and most importantly, she never challenged him. She was, in his estimation, a perfectly functional piece of furniture. Tonight, that piece of furniture was to perform its primary function: service. "I need you to be brilliant tonight, Ilara," he'd said, not looking up from the knot of his silk tie he was adjusting in the hall mirror. His reflection was crisp, sharp, a man of consequence. "I have an exceptionally important guest coming for dinner. This could be a game changer for me." Ilara stood in the doorway of the living room, wiping her hands on a simple cotton apron. "Of course, Julian. What would you like me to make?" He finally turned, his eyes flicking over her with a familiar air of faint disappointment. The simple dress, the hair tied back, the absence of jewelry, it all screamed unimportant. "Something impressive, French. The coq au vin you made that one time was adequate. Do that, but better. And a proper potato gratin, not that mushy thing you made for my mother last Christmas. Everything must be perfect. The wine is already chilling. A Montrachet. It cost a fortune, so for God's sake don't drop it." He thought this was just another dinner, another rung on the ladder he was so desperately climbing. He thought he was showcasing his power, his sophisticated palate, his beautiful home. He didn't know that the foundation of that home was sand, that the ladder was leaning against a collapsing wall, and that the quiet woman in the apron held the detonator to it all. He didn't know that by the end of the night, the world he had so carefully constructed for himself would be nothing more than ash and bitter regret. Within 3 hours, the man who saw himself as a king would be reduced to a beggar in his own dining room. We've all seen arrogance like Julian's, haven't we? That supreme confidence that comes from never being truly tested. It makes you wonder what happens when the real world finally shows up. If you're enjoying this story already, I'd be so grateful if you'd give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more tales of justice and revelation. And I'd love to know where you're watching from today. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to the kitchen, where the first act of this tragedy was about to unfold. The kitchen was Ilara's domain. It was the one room in the sprawling, minimalist house that felt like her own. It was warm, filled with the scent of herbs and the comforting weight of cast-iron pans. Julian had wanted a sterile, chrome and steel laboratory, a showpiece, but Ilara had quietly insisted on this space, with its butcher block countertops and deep farmhouse sink. It was where she found her peace. But tonight the familiar comfort was gone, replaced by a cold, simmering tension. The room felt less like a sanctuary and more like a stage for her humiliation. She moved with a practiced, fluid grace that Julian never bothered to notice. Her hands, which he considered unremarkable, knew their work. They expertly jointed the chicken, the knife moving through cartilage and bone with precise, confident strokes. She diced pancetta into perfect, uniform lardons, the rhythmic tap of the blade on the board, a steady drumbeat against the anxious silence of the house. Onions, carrots, and celery fell into a fine mirepoix under her swift ministrations. She was not just cooking, she was performing a ritual, a complex dance of ingredients and techniques she had mastered years ago, long before she had met Julian. He believed her cooking was a domestic hobby, a simple skill she'd picked up from her mother. The truth was far grander. Ilara had spent a year in Lyon, studying at the prestigious Institut Paul Bocuse, a fact she had kept to herself. She had wanted Julian to love her for her character, not for a pedigree he could boast about at his country club. She had wanted to build a life on a foundation of genuine affection, not on the transactional value of her accomplishments. It had been a romantic, naive notion, and its failure was the quiet ache in her heart. As she seared the chicken pieces in the hot Dutch oven, the rich aroma filling the air, she felt a familiar presence before she heard the voice. "Well, isn't this a production?" Eleanor Vance, Julian's mother, stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. She was a woman sculpted from disapproval, her face a permanent mask of pinched dissatisfaction. She surveyed the organized chaos of Alara's prep station, the bowls of meticulously chopped vegetables, the bouquet garni tied with perfect string, and her thin lips tightened further. "Julian tells me this is for a very important client," Eleanor said, her tone implying that Alara was the weak link in this crucial endeavor. "I hope you're up to the task, dear. His career is at a very delicate stage." "I'll do my best, Eleanor," Alara replied, her voice even as she deglazed the pan with a splash of brandy, the flames leaping up for a dramatic, controlled second. Eleanor sniffed, pretending the flare of alcohol-fueled fire was a sign of incompetence. "You must be careful. Presentation is everything. Men like Julian's associates are used to a certain standard, the kind one finds in restaurants, not here." She gestured vaguely at the homey kitchen, her disdain as thick as the sauce Ilara was beginning to build. Ilara continued her work, adding the mirepoix to the pan, her movements unhurried. "I'm sure it will be fine." "Fine is the enemy of excellent, Ilara. Julian is excellent. He deserves a partner who reflects that." Eleanor walked over and picked up a silver locket from a small, velvet-lined tray on the counter. It was a simple, antique piece. "Is this what you're planning to wear?" Ilara paused, her hand hovering over a container of pearl onions. "I wasn't planning on joining them for dinner. Julian said to stay in the kitchen." Eleanor's expression softened into something that passed for sympathy, but was in fact triumphant pity. "Oh, my dear, of course. Well, that's probably for the best. You need to focus on the food. It's so important to know one's role." She placed the locket back down with a dismissive clink. "Julian has worked so hard to get where he is. He's built this entire life for you from nothing. The least you can do is make sure the chicken isn't dry." Built this life for her. The words echoed in the cavernous space between what Eleanor believed and what Ilara knew to be true. From the corner of her eye, Ilara glanced at a small, unassuming object on the windowsill, half hidden behind a pot of basil. It was a small, intricately carved wooden box, no bigger than her palm. The dark walnut was worn smooth with time. Her father had carved it for her on her 16th birthday to hold her favorite saffron threads. Whenever she felt the weight of Julian's world pressing down on her, she would touch that box. It was a tangible link to a different reality, a world where she was not adequate or provincial, but cherished. A world where her father, Marcus Thorne, looked at her not as a supporting character, but as the center of his universe. She ran her thumb over the lid, the familiar pattern of a carved star grounding her. She could endure this. The end was closer than any of them knew. She turned back to the stove, added the rich burgundy wine to the pot, and began the slow, patient simmer. The stage was almost set. The doorbell chimed, a crisp, two-note sound that sliced through the thick, fragrant air of the kitchen. Julian, who had been pacing in the living room, straightened his jacket and shot a look toward Ilara. "That's her. Stay here," he commanded, his voice a low hiss. "You're covered in whatever that is. Just focus on the timing. I want the main course on the table at 8 o'clock sharp. Not a minute before, not a minute after." Ilara nodded, turning her attention to the potato gratin she was pulling from the oven, its top a perfect, bubbling gold. She heard the front door open, followed by Julian's voice, suddenly transformed. It was deeper, richer, coated in a syrupy charm he reserved for those he wished to impress. "Chloe, darling, you look absolutely breathtaking. he purred. A woman's laughter, high and tinkling like expensive crystal, floated back to the kitchen. Julian, you spoil me. Is that Montrachet I smell? Only the best for you, he answered. Come, let me give you the grand tour, though you've seen most of it. Ilara's hands stilled. Chloe. He had brought Chloe to their home. She had suspected, of course. The late nights he claimed were meetings, the scent of a perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his shirts, the sudden, secretive phone calls. But to bring his mistress into their house, to have his wife cook for her, this was a new, more profound level of cruelty. It was a violation not just of their marriage vows, but of the sanctity of her home, her space. A cold knot formed in her stomach, but her face remained a mask of placid concentration. She would not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. A moment later, Julian appeared in the kitchen doorway, Chloe on his arm. She was everything Ilara was not. Tall, sleek, poured into a scarlet dress that shimmered under the recessed lighting. Diamonds glittered at her ears and throat. She looked like she belonged on the cover of a magazine, and she knew it. And this, Julian announced with the flourish of a ringmaster, is where the magic happens. Chloe, this is my wife, Ilara. Chloe's perfectly painted lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her gaze swept over Ilara, from her simple flats to the stray wisp of hair that had escaped her bun, lingering for a moment on the faint sheen of perspiration on her brow. It was the look of a predator assessing a non-threatening herbivore. Oh, Chloe said, her voice dripping with condescension. It's so charmingly domestic. Julian, you are just so lucky to have someone who can do all of this for you. The word someone was delivered with a delicate, dismissive flick of her wrist, as if referring to a household appliance. She has her uses, Julian said with a conspiratorial wink at Chloe, a casual betrayal that cut Ilara deeper than a shout would have. He picked a grape from a bowl on the counter and popped it into Chloe's mouth. Now, I had Ilara prepare some canapés. Why don't you bring them out to the living room for us, dear? It wasn't a request. It was an order. He was casting her in the role of a servant in her own home, and Chloe was the guest of honor. Ilara said nothing. She moved to the refrigerator and took out a silver tray laden with delicate mushroom vol au vents and prosciutto-wrapped figs. Each one was a perfect, bite-sized work of art. She had made them with the same care and precision she was giving the main course. As she carried the tray past them, Chloe leaned in and whispered to Julian, loud enough for Ilara to hear, "She's very obedient, isn't she?" Julian's low chuckle was the only answer. In the living room, Ilara placed the tray on the marble coffee table. Julian and Chloe had already settled onto the white sofa, sitting closer than was appropriate, a glass of the pale gold Montrachet in each of their hands. They did not acknowledge her. They were already deep in a conversation about a gallery opening, their heads bent together intimately. Ilara was invisible, a ghost in her own life. She retreated to the kitchen, the sound of their laughter following her like a physical blow. She closed the door, not slamming it, but shutting it with a quiet finality. The simmering pot on the stove seemed to mock her with its warmth. She had been a fool, she thought, not for wanting to be loved for herself, but for believing a man like Julian was capable of such love. The test she had set for him 5 years ago hadn't just been failed. It had been utterly, contemptuously desecrated. The next hour was a masterclass in humiliation, orchestrated by Julian with the casual cruelty of a bored child pulling the wings off a fly. Ilara brought the food to the dining table, a magnificent spread that would have earned accolades in any fine dining establishment. The coq au vin was rich and glossy, the chicken falling off the bone, the sauce a perfect wine-dark velvet. The gratin was creamy and decadent, scented with nutmeg and Gruyere. The haricots verts were bright green and crisp, tossed with toasted almonds. She served them like a silent automaton, moving around the table to fill their plates, refilling their wine glasses before they were even empty. Neither Julian nor Chloe spoke a word to her. They talked over her, through her, as if she were simply a pair of disembodied hands. Their conversation was a deliberate performance for her benefit, a tapestry of their shared life woven with threads of inside jokes, future plans, and casual intimacy. "When we're in Monaco next month," Chloe said, twirling a piece of chicken on her fork, "we simply must have dinner at Le Louis XV. Alain Ducasse is a genius. Their sommelier is divine." "Book it," Julian said immediately. "Whatever you want, darling." He caught Ilara's eye for a fleeting second as she reached to top up his water glass, a flicker of smug triumph in his gaze. He was showing her what she was losing, what she was too plain and provincial to ever be a part of. He even found a way to criticize the masterpiece she had prepared. Taking a deliberate, performative bite, he chewed thoughtfully for a moment before pronouncing his verdict. "It's good, Ilara," he said, addressing the air in her general direction. "A little heavy on the tarragon, perhaps, but passable." Chloe, taking her cue, chimed in. "My personal chef does a much lighter version. He uses a white wine base. It's more refined." Ilara felt a hot surge of anger, a rare and startling emotion for her. Her chef, this woman who had likely never cooked a meal in her life, was critiquing a dish that Ilara could prepare in her sleep with more skill than 1,000 personal chefs. But she swallowed the anger, compressing it into a cold, hard diamond of resolve in her chest. Her time would come. After they had finished, pushing their plates away with sighs of overindulgence, Julian stood. "That was wonderful, darling," he said to Chloe, completely ignoring the woman who had actually cooked the meal. He then walked into the kitchen, where Ilara was already beginning to clear the countertops. He gestured with his chin toward the dining table, where the ornate serving platters sat with the remnants of the feast. A few pieces of chicken swam in the cooling sauce, a large scoop of gratin was left, and a handful of green beans were scattered. It was the food they had picked over, the parts they had deemed unworthy. "You can have that," he said, his voice casual, magnanimous. "Don't want it to go to waste, do we? Clear the rest of the plates away when you're done." He turned and walked back to his guest, leaving Ilara standing in the pristine kitchen, staring at the scraps he had so generously offered her. It was the ultimate degradation. She was not worthy of a fresh plate. She was to eat their leftovers, like a dog waiting for scraps from the master's table. In that moment, something inside her shifted. The quiet ache of a failing marriage transformed into the cold, clean anger of absolute certainty. The watercolor had been washed away, and what was left was sketched in stark, unforgiving charcoal. She looked at the plate of scraps and then at the clock on the wall. 8:45 p.m. Her father was due in 15 minutes. The curtain was about to rise on the final act. The clatter of silverware being dropped onto plates echoed from the dining room, followed by another burst of Chloe's shrill laughter. Ilara moved through the kitchen with a deliberate, almost unnerving calm. She scraped the leftover food from the main serving dishes, the food Julian had offered her, into the bin. She would not eat their scraps. She would rather starve. She began to wash the pots and pans, the warm water and soap a mundane comfort in the midst of the swirling, emotional storm. The house was quiet for a moment, the only sounds the rhythmic scrape of her sponge against copper and the low hum of the refrigerator. It was the quiet before the storm, a pocket of stillness pregnant with impending chaos. She could hear them now in the living room, the clink of glasses telling her Julian had opened another bottle of wine. He was celebrating his victory, his successful conquest, and the concurrent subjugation of his wife. He believed he had everything perfectly under his control. Julian's phone buzzed on the dining table, a harsh, insistent sound. He let out an audible groan of irritation. "Ugh, another one," she heard him say to Chloe. "It's my associate. I told him to swing by after 9 to pick up the project renderings. He's early. Some people have no sense of timing." Chloe's voice was a low murmur. "Send him away, Julian. I don't want to be interrupted." "Don't worry, darling. It's a nobody, a logistics guy for the new waterfront project. Name's Thorne or something. He'll be in and out in 30 seconds. Probably just wants to get home to his dreary little life. He laughed, a short, barking sound full of contempt for the nobodies of the world, the men who had to run errands for important people like him. At that exact moment, Alara's own phone, resting on the countertop, vibrated silently. The screen lit up with a text message. She picked it up, her hands now dry and steady. The message was from a contact simply named Dad. 5 minutes out, are you ready, my star? A small, genuine smile touched Alara's lips for the first time that night. The pet name was one he'd used since she was a little girl, a term of endearment from a world away, from a life where she was treasured. She quickly typed her reply, her thumb moving with purpose. Ready, Dad. She sent the message and placed the phone back on the counter. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, she reached behind her back and untied the strings of her stained apron. The apron, which had felt like a costume of servitude all evening, was now just a piece of cloth. She folded it neatly into a perfect square and placed it on the edge of the sink. She ran her hands down the front of her simple navy blue dress, smoothing out the wrinkles. She tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. She was no longer the cook, the maid, the servant. She was Alara Thorne, and she was waiting for her father. She walked to the doorway of the kitchen and leaned against the frame, her arms crossed, watching the living room. She was in the shadows, but she could see them clearly. Julian, flushed with wine and arrogance, his arm draped possessively over the back of the sofa behind Chloe's shoulders. Chloe, preening under his attention, basking in the glow of her perceived triumph. They were two predators who had cornered their prey, so confident in their kill that they didn't hear the approach of the true apex predator, the one who owned the entire forest. The air grew still, thick with unspoken promises and impending revelations. The next chime of the doorbell would not be an interruption. It would be a reckoning. The doorbell rang, its crisp notes cleaving the air. It was a sound that had, just an hour before, signaled the beginning of Alara's torment. Now, it sounded to her like a trumpet call. Julian groaned dramatically, extracting himself from his comfortable position next to Chloe. Honestly, the nerve of some people. I'll get rid of him quickly. He shot a glare toward the kitchen. Stay there, he barked, assuming Alara was still hiding among the dirty dishes. He hadn't noticed her standing in the shadows of the doorway, a silent sentinel. He strode to the front door and pulled it open with an air of impatient authority. Standing on the doorstep was a man who seemed to command the very space he occupied. He was in his late 50s, with a mane of silver-streaked dark hair and a face that spoke of intelligence and hard-won battles. He wore a charcoal suit tailored with such precision it seemed a part of him, an extension of his own quiet, formidable power. This was Marcus Thorne. Julian, blinded by his own arrogance, saw none of this. He saw what he expected to see, a subordinate, an errand boy. The suit was nice, he registered absently, but the man was probably overcompensating. You're early, Julian said, his tone clipped and dismissive. He didn't offer a handshake or an invitation to enter. The documents are on the hall table over there. Just sign the courier receipt with my wife. She's in the kitchen. He gestured vaguely over his shoulder with his thumb, already turning back toward the living room and the far more important company of Chloe. Chloe didn't even bother to look up from her wineglass, swirling the golden liquid with a bored expression. But Marcus Thorne did not move toward the hall table. He did not look for a pen. His eyes, a startlingly sharp blue, bypassed Julian entirely, scanning the space until they found Alara in the shadows of the kitchen doorway. For a single, heart-stopping second, an expression of immense, profound pain flickered across Marcus's face. He took in the entire scene in an instant, the expensive wine, the other woman draped across the sofa, the opulent dinner for two, and his daughter, standing alone, relegated to the role of a spectator in her own home. The mask of calm control slipped for just a moment, revealing the raw fury of a father seeing his child in pain. Then, just as quickly, it was back in place, replaced by an expression of glacial composure. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it carried across the room with effortless authority. Ilara. It was the only word he said, but it changed everything. Ilara pushed herself off the doorframe and walked out of the shadows and into the light. She moved with a newfound confidence, her head held high. She walked straight to Marcus, ignoring Julian and Chloe completely. "Dad," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I'm so glad you could make it." The bomb had been dropped. The silence that followed was absolute, a deafening void where the sounds of tinkling laughter and smug conversation had just been. Julian, who had been halfway back to the sofa, froze. He turned slowly, his face a comical mask of confusion. "Dad?" he stammered, looking from Ilara to the imposing figure at the door. "What is she talking about?" His brain, addled by wine and self-importance, struggled to connect the dots. Then, a flicker of horrified recognition ignited in his eyes. He had seen that face before. In the Financial Times, on the cover of Forbes, at the head of a boardroom table in a presentation he'd once given. The logistics guy, Thorne, Marcus Thorne. You're Marcus Thorne," Julian breathed, the words barely audible. "From Thorne Industries." Marcus Thorne's gaze finally settled on Julian, and it was as cold and unforgiving as a winter sea. "I am," he confirmed, his voice dangerously soft. "And you are the man who married my only daughter." He took a step into the house, his presence seeming to shrink the large foyer. He looked from the panicked face of his son-in-law to the smirking woman on the sofa, and then back to Julian. "The man who, if I understand correctly, was just about to instruct my daughter to eat his leftovers in the home I bought for her." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every softly spoken word landed like a physical blow, shattering the smug, self-satisfied world Julian had built around himself. The reckoning had begun. Panic, pure and unadulterated, seized Julian. His carefully constructed persona of a man in control evaporated, leaving behind a flailing, desperate creature. His face, moments ago flushed with wine and triumph, was now a sickly, waxy white. "Mr. Thorne, sir," he stammered, rushing forward, his hands held up in a placating gesture. "This is all a terrible misunderstanding, a joke. We were just playing a little game." Chloe on the sofa was frozen solid. The wine glass trembled in her hand. The name Marcus Thorne was not just a name, it was a legend in the financial world, a titan of industry whose net worth was discussed in hushed, reverent tones. She had just spent the evening mocking the daughter of one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the country. The sheer, catastrophic scale of her miscalculation washed over her, and she felt a wave of nausea. Marcus paid Julian no mind. He walked past him as if he were a piece of furniture, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He entered the dining room, his sharp eyes surveying the scene of the crime. He noted the 2 wine glasses, the 2 plates, the expensive bottle of Montrachet. His gaze fell upon the main serving platter on the sideboard, the one with the picked-over scraps of coq au vin that Julian had so benevolently offered to his wife. He looked at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable but radiating a chilling intensity. He turned back to Julian. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his voice still deceptively soft. The quietness was more terrifying than any shout. It was the sound of controlled, absolute power. "It seems quite clear to me. You are entertaining your mistress in the home my daughter owns. A home, I should clarify, that I purchased for her as a wedding gift. You are compelling my daughter, a woman who trained at the Institut Paul Bocuse, to act as your personal servant. And you concluded this charming evening by offering her your table scraps." Marcus paused, letting the weight of each accusation settle in the suffocating silence. "Enlighten me, Julian. Which part of that did I misunderstand?" Ilara had moved to stand beside her father. She was silent, her composure a stark contrast to Julian's unraveling panic. Her stillness was her strength, her silence a more damning condemnation than any word she could have spoken. She simply watched the man she had married disintegrate. Julian, desperate for a foothold, did the only thing a coward could do. He tried to shift the blame. "She deceived me," he cried, his voice cracking. He pointed a trembling finger at Alara. "She never told me. She let me believe her family was simple, middle class. This is her fault. She lied to me from the beginning." The accusation hung in the air, pathetic and absurd. Chloe, seeing an opportunity to deflect, nodded vigorously from the sofa. "He's right. She was pretending to be someone she's not." Marcus Thorne actually smiled. It was a terrifying sight, devoid of all warmth, a mere baring of teeth. "My daughter's deception, as you call it, was a test, Julian, a test of character, a test to see if she could find a man who would love her for the brilliant, kind, and talented woman she is, not for the name Thorne and the fortune attached to it." He took another step closer, forcing Julian to back away. "It was a test you have failed more spectacularly, more completely than I could ever have imagined. You see, I was against it. I told her that a man's true nature is revealed not by what he thinks he can gain, but by how he treats those he believes have nothing to offer. And in that, at least, you have proven me right." The final words were delivered with the cold finality of a judge passing sentence. The trial was over. Now came the punishment. The unraveling of Julian Vance did not happen all at once. It was a methodical, surgical dismantling, performed by Marcus Thorne with the cold precision of a master strategist. "Let's talk about your hard work, Julian," Marcus began, his voice a low, conversational hum that was more menacing than a roar. "Let's talk about the life you believe you built." He began to pace slowly around the room, his presence dominating the space. "You're a junior vice president at Sterling Cross Investments, are you not? A position you attained with remarkable speed 2 years ago." Julian nodded dumbly, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Perhaps this was a way out, his career. He was good at his job. "Yes, sir, I've exceeded all my targets." "Impressive," Marcus said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "You might be interested to know that Thorne Industries acquired a 60% controlling interest in Sterling Cross's parent company 25 months ago. A quiet acquisition. Your promotion, which you celebrated with such vigor, was facilitated at my daughter's request. She thought it would make you happy." Julian's jaw went slack. The cornerstone of his identity, his career success, had just been pulverized. He hadn't earned it. It had been given to him. "The car you're so proud of," Marcus continued, not missing a beat, "the black Porsche you parked so carefully at the front of the country club. A beautiful machine. The lease for that vehicle is held by a private trust. A trust I established for Alara's discretionary spending. You've effectively been using my daughter's pocket money to fund your little status symbol." Each revelation was another blow, stripping away a layer of Julian's manufactured self-worth. He sank into one of the dining chairs, his body looking heavy, deflated. "And this house," Marcus said, gesturing around the beautifully appointed room, "this monument to your good taste. You boast about the mortgage you secured, the clever way you've managed the asset. Julian, my daughter's name is the only one on the deed. I paid for this house in cash. There is no mortgage. The monthly payments you've been making have been going directly into a savings account in her name. A nest egg she was building, I imagine, for a future you were never going to be a part of." This was the final, fatal blow. The very ground beneath his feet was not his own. He was not the king of his castle. He was a guest, and his lease had just expired. He was a fraud, living a fraudulent life, and the curtain had been ripped away to reveal the pathetic, empty stage behind. Chloe, seeing the ship sinking with astonishing speed, decided it was time to abandon it. She stood up, grabbing her small, expensive clutch. I think I should go," she stammered, trying to make herself as small as possible. Marcus's head snapped toward her. He didn't raise his voice, but his gaze pinned her in place. "You will stay," he commanded. "You were a willing participant in this evening's entertainment. You will remain for the final act." Chloe froze, then sank back onto the edge of the sofa, her face pale with fear. Having completely dismantled Julian's world, Marcus turned his attention to the one person whose opinion truly mattered. He looked at his daughter, his expression softening, the icy fury replaced by a deep, paternal love. The power, which he had so masterfully wielded, he now handed to her. "Ilara, my dear," he said gently, "what do you want to do?" The room fell silent. All eyes were on Ilara. The quiet, unassuming woman in the simple dress now held all the cards. Julian, his face buried in his hands, looked up, his eyes pleading. Chloe watched, her own fate hanging in the balance. For the first time all night, Ilara was not invisible. She was the most powerful person in the room. Ilara took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs and steadying her resolve. The years of quiet slights, of being overlooked, of being made to feel small and inadequate, coalesced into a single moment of crystalline clarity. She looked at the man crumpled in the dining chair, the man she had once loved, or at least had tried to love. She felt no hatred. She felt no desire for revenge. All she felt was a profound and sorrowful finality. The love, long withered, had finally turned to dust. She met his desperate, pleading eyes, and her voice, when she spoke, was not the timid whisper he was used to. It was the clear, steady voice of a woman who knew her own worth. "I want a divorce, Julian," she said. The words were simple, devastating, final. There was no room for negotiation in her tone, no hint of hesitation. It was a statement of fact. Julian let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. He stumbled from the chair and fell to his knees before her, grabbing at the hem of her dress. "No, Ilara, please," he begged, his face wet with tears. "Don't do this. I love you. I was a fool, a complete idiot. I see that now. We can fix this. I'll do anything." Ilara looked down at the pathetic figure at her feet. The arrogant, commanding man from a few hours ago was gone, replaced by this groveling child. "No, Julian," she said gently but firmly, pulling her dress from his grasp. "You don't love me. You love the comfort I provided. You love the stable, adoring background I created for your life. You never once took the time to actually see me. Tonight you just made that impossible to ignore." She then turned her gaze to Chloe, who flinched as if struck. "And I want you to understand something," Ilara continued, her voice holding a note of steel. "This was never about the money or the status. I would have happily lived in a small apartment and cooked on a hot plate if I was with a man who respected me. This was about decency. It was about kindness. It was about respect. Concepts that the two of you seem to find provincial." She threw Eleanor's earlier insult back like a sharpened dart. With that, she turned her back on them both. She walked calmly to the hall closet, her steps sure and even. She opened the door and retrieved a small navy blue suitcase. It was not large, but it was packed. It had been waiting there for 2 weeks, a silent testament to the fact that this was not an impulsive decision, but a carefully considered conclusion. The quiet preparation for her new life. She walked to the front door where her father was waiting. He put a protective arm around her shoulders. Before they stepped out, Marcus paused and looked back one last time at the wreckage in the living room. His final words were delivered to Julian's bowed head. "You will be hearing from my lawyers in the morning, a team of them. Regarding your position at Sterling Cross, it is, as of this moment, no longer tenable. You're fired. As for this house, you have 24 hours to vacate the premises. I suggest you pack." He didn't wait for a reply. He guided Ilara out into the cool night air, away from the suffocating drama of the house. The heavy front door closed behind them, not with a slam, but with a soft, decisive click. It was the sound of a chapter ending. It was the sound of freedom. It left Julian and Chloe alone in the opulent tomb of a life that was no longer theirs. 6 months passed. The seasons turned, washing the city in the cool tones of autumn and then the stark whites of winter. For Julian Vance, it was a season of unending winter. The life he had known was gone, obliterated as if it had never been. The lawyers Marcus Thorne had promised were as efficient and ruthless as their employer. Julian was not just fired, he was disgraced, his facilitated career path becoming a whispered joke in the financial circles he once frequented. No one would hire him. He now lived in a cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the grimier side of town, the kind of place he used to speed past in his Porsche with a shudder of disgust. The Porsche was gone, repossessed within 48 hours. His bespoke suits hung in the tiny closet like relics from another man's life. He worked a soul-crushing job in data entry, the click of his keyboard a constant, maddening reminder of his fall. His mother Eleanor was no comfort. She visited him once, looked around the dingy apartment with undisguised horror, and blamed him for his unforgivable stupidity. "You had it all, Julian," she had hissed, "and you threw it away for that cheap little tramp. You broke your own life, and you broke mine along with it." Their relationship, once a pillar of his ego, was now just another ruin in the landscape of his life. He was a ghost, haunted by the memory of a feast he thought he was hosting, but at which he had been the main course. Chloe fared no better. The story of that night had spread through their social and professional circles like a contagion. Marcus Thorne had made no overt threats against her, but he didn't need to. The simple fact of her involvement was enough. She became a pariah. Business contacts stopped returning her calls. Friends suddenly became too busy for lunch. The invitations to galas and gallery openings ceased. She was branded as the woman who had tried to humiliate a Thorne, a mark of social suicide from which there was no recovery. Her personal chef quit, and she found herself alone in her sterile, white condo, the silence a constant reminder of the vibrant social life she had so carelessly torched. And Ilara? Ilara thrived. In the immediate aftermath, she had leaned on her father, allowing his strength to be her shield. But quickly, her own resilience, her own long-suppressed power, began to shine through. She had not retreated into the gilded cage of her family's wealth. Instead, she had carved out a space for herself within it. Drawing on her culinary training and her innate business sense, a trait she had inherited from her father, she pitched a new concept to the Thorne Industries board, a gourmet food division, specializing in artisanal, ethically sourced products. The board, initially skeptical, was won over by her passion, her meticulous business plan, and the quiet, unshakable confidence she exuded. 6 months later, Ilara's table was a runaway success. She was not just a figurehead, she was the creative force, the CEO, the heart of the operation. She worked long, fulfilling hours, surrounded by a team who respected her talent and her vision. The soft, unassuming watercolor had revealed itself to be a vibrant, powerful masterpiece. She looked radiant, her face glowing with a purpose and happiness that no cosmetic could replicate. She had found her power not in her father's name, but in her own name, her own talent, which she was now, finally, free to embrace. One crisp afternoon, she sat with her father for lunch. Not in a stuffy, Michelin-starred restaurant, but on a simple wooden bench in the public botanical gardens, a place she had always loved. They shared a thermos of soup she had made and a loaf of fresh bread. There was no pretense, no performance, just the easy comfort of a father and daughter who loved and respected one another. "Are you happy, my star?" Marcus asked, his eyes full of warmth. Ilara looked out at the riot of late-blooming flowers, at the families laughing on the grass, at the simple, beautiful tapestry of life. She thought of Julian, of Chloe, of the house that was no longer hers. She felt no anger, no bitterness, only a distant, quiet pity. They had been so obsessed with the symbols of a good life, the money, the status, the appearances, that they had missed the substance of it entirely. True wealth, the narrator might reflect, is not found in bank accounts or designer labels, but in dignity, integrity, and the respect we give and receive. Julian had mistaken the scaffolding for the building, and when the storm of truth finally came, all that was left was the hollow space where a real foundation should have been. Ilara, on the other hand, had built her new life on the bedrock of her own character, and it was a structure that no storm could ever shake. What do you think is the most important element of a person's true worth? Is it their character, their achievements, or how they treat others? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. If you found this story satisfying, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. We'll see you in the next story.